There we go.
What is this, a UFO symposium?
Yeah, exactly. I'm having flashbacks.
Which means it'll be a great success.
Okay, well, welcome to Immune Manifesto episode 20. Josh is on today, and very excited to welcome Studio Virosa as well. We have all three core members of Studio Virosa, an experimental media collaboration that I'm excited to unpack two of their short films, Horror Magic and Fishbowl. But before all of that, can the three of you, would you be willing to introduce yourselves as individuals?
Alphabetical order, Brian or Alex first?
Yeah. I'm Alex A. Jones. I'm a writer and artist. I write about art and ecology and occult ideas of reality. And for me, being part of a cinema collective in Virosa is a really integral part of my practice as a writer that allows me to get out of that hermetic space of just writing in my basement all day, every day, and to find out the kinds of stories and ideas that emerge out of collaboration, and also that allow me to work more performatively as a writer. So yeah, that's kind of a tiny taste of me.
I am Brian Wilson. I am an artist and a director, and much of my work crosses many different disciplines between craft and traditional fine art spaces, and most recently working with cinema and film as a medium. And I would say that is best expressed with the collaboration I have with Alex and Cameron via Virosa. And a lot of that came out of kind of a mutual frustration, I think, of just being siloed away in the studio, the individual artist working and occasionally showing in a curated venue. The promise of cinema was always, A, to be able to work with other people, to work collaboratively with others. Cinema is a inherently collaborative medium in that way, and the convergence of a lot of different disciplines. So that kind of organically appealed to my heart. And not only that, it's a way of also very directly addressing some problems, deficiencies, rot that we'd see in kind of how cinema is largely consumed, produced, and propagated. So, yeah.
I'm Cameron Clausen. I am also an artist working in sculpture and video, primarily through the world of 3D and simulation mediums. So I work a lot in VFX softwares and kind of twist those to sculptural and video ends that they wouldn't normally be used for. And also in the context of Virosa, I'm the occasional mutant composer, kind of heading up the sound department.
If we were a band, Cameron would play all the instruments, and Brian and I would just be gesticulating in the foreground.
For sure.
Bringing the show.
Yeah.
I would assume you would sometimes wear those kind of like masks and stuff, maybe like special effects masks. If you were a band, you'd have some kind of like mutant appearance.
Yeah, there'd be projection involved for sure.
It would be masks all the way
I love
down.
that.
Just swap masks of each other's faces.
Because like on your
Hannibal Lecter
website,
style.
on like the Studio Virosa website, there's not just short films listed. There's like a bunch of different stuff. there's this portrait series that's really interesting to me that has like all these different juxtaposed images that kind of look like chimeric, mutant kind of hybrid creatures. There's a bunch of there's a bunch of different stuff on the website. And if you wouldn't mind, I'm gonna read the little splash intro page here for Virosa Studios before I ask about sort of the origin and how it got started. So it says, Virosa is a collective voice working to expand the cinematic arts. We produce experimental narrative films, drawing influence from contemporary art practices and video games, as well as the established film canon. We commit ourselves to formal risk-taking, knowing that the art of cinema is in a paradigm shift. Virosa resists the unsustainable and unwieldy practices of Hollywood, aspiring to a new mode of, quote, degenerate cinema. We use hacked digital tools, game engines, and experimental photography to generate value beyond our limited financial resources. Founded in 2020, the year of the plague, Virosa makes films for a future in which technology will not deliver the utopias promised, and magic lanterns must be made to shine light upon dark times. Long live cinema. Yeah, I think that touches on a couple themes that I heard in your individual intros even. Brian mentioned being interested in, film as a site for collaboration by definition, and also interdisciplinarianism. And then also, I happened to be looking around, and I found on the Brooklyn Rail double helix little thing that Alex posted in 2020, where you say, I worship twin gods, the image and the text. They're like two chemical elements irreducible to one another. And Alex, you also mentioned this wanting to, this idea of the medium being able to express different aspects of a search, whether it's text or image or this or that. So I guess my question really is why film, why horror, and why Virosa? What is Virosa? Where did it come from?
Well,
Now we'll go to the theme.
there are, like you mentioned, that there are a lot of different types of experimental images that we've created, much more than short films. And, a lot of that, I would say that one of our original crossovers in the interests among the three of us was the idea of monsters, or the idea of chimeras, as you say. Being all very attuned to the importance of monsters and the types of stories that we appreciate, in the horror, sci-fi space, and, all having felt a sort of identification with the monster as an underexplored territory for narrative. And so we really started collaborating in making these experimental composited 3D images, and trying to experiment with very old cinema techniques as well, pinhole photography and Petzval lens filters, and just trying to create images that really transformed their subjects into something uncanny and something maybe a little monstrous. And it's interesting because when we started doing that as a practice, stories started to suggest themselves, and so the ideas for the more narrative works started to come out of just creating these chimeras. And maybe I'll pass it over to Brian to say that the generation of images and projects that are not just narrative films is really integral to Virosa. And it is what is referenced in that little bio, which we call degenerate cinema.
Yeah, I would say that amongst the three of us, we all have a real affinity for the capacity that certain mediums can do, and always trying to pay attention to okay, well, what is a specific approach, a specific process, a specific medium, what can it do that others can't? And I think the most fruitful spaces of art and cinema are that you can say many things at the same time. So there's kind of this superposition that's baked in with the processes and methods that we gravitate towards. At the same time, there's always kind of like a quality where the making of the image, the writing of the narrative, the manifesting of a film, the doing of it is in a lot of ways as important as the end product, or the end artifact. And that trying to pay attention to how there's kind of correspondences or patterns that can be kind of echoed in a kind of circularity or in a kind of superposition, as I said, or a layering. That tends to be kind of the philosophy, the kind of making that I would say is distinct for us as this kind of three-headed entity of Virosa, which again is the three of us overlain, I think, very much. And we're always kind of striving to find equity or some kind of balance in terms of voice, vision, and interests. And a lot of those tend to kind of circle back to some similar territory, similar philosophies, similar approaches that are have strong relationships to that, like alchemy, like cinema itself, writing as well. And now that we live in a golden age of readily available digital tools, I think there's also been this fascination of acts of translation. What can a digital space do that an analog or meat space can't do, and vice versa? And what happens when you try to shave the edges of the square peg into the round hole, shall we say? What kind of forms happen? Is that even possible? What are the limits of that?
And there's a lot of like radioactive waste, so to speak, that comes off of that process of exploring what these media can do and also doing that collaboratively. We generate so much in the way of drawings and writings and renderings and sketches in the process of trying to communicate with each other about the ideas that, again, the output of the collective becomes much more than, the finished film. And that's something I think we've discovered we're very interested in as this antithesis to, Hollywood filmmaking, this sort of, like everything else, this commodified form of filmmaking, where, the output of Virosa is much more kind of diffuse and multimedia.
Yeah, and porous as well too. That there's opportunities for. There's also very much an acknowledgement. And I think it's shared amongst the three of us, have this kind of proposition that the best an artist can really do is 50% of any project. It really depends on the audience to fulfill the kind of remainder of that balance. So there's something within cinema that explicitly demands an audience, and the audience is an essential component of that. And nowadays, it's such a confusion of where the audience actually exists. I would say you both reaching out to us is a perfect example of that, totally unexpected. We don't necessarily, the relationship that we have with you is solely through putting it a message in the bottle of the social media sphere, the internet, the kind of in the ether. And I think that's something I think we're also really fascinated about, of where, who does it speak to, and how does that, in turn, that opportunity for a dialogue or a feedback, how does that change subsequent projects, And I'm wondering, I'm curious, I think that probably in terms of a formal approach, the thing that we really hold to our hearts is this kind of interplay between digital tools and analog or very handcrafted tools, which Cam could probably talk a little bit more about with more fluency than I can.
What I have to say about that, I think a signature part of what might be our visual style is this kind of constant reworking of things. We call it putting it through the meat grinder. Brian talking about the analog space. And so, we use a lot of 3D tools and image rendering and things like this. And then it always has that telltale sign of being digitally born. So usually we use tools like reprojecting and reshooting that video and then reshooting it again, bringing it back into the computer, back into the real world, printing it on film, just constantly reworking these things until they become imbued with that whole process. And I think, we do that, try to do that through the sound as well, through the image and kind of through every part of the process.
Yeah, it's almost constructivist. I think I recall a lot of our early conversations around cinema revolving around things like surrealist film from the 20s. There's kind of like before cinema became really all about the naturalism of things, trying to like sell this like reality, this sort of fourth wall, and how we liked and still kind of aspire to a more constructed reality within the cinematic reality.
And in the case of digital media, I don't think we've ever included something in a finished project that hasn't been existing in our space, our physical space.
Yeah, real photons, baby.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, like there's this idea. Okay, so like I think that place is a big theme here. Okay, just to tie a couple threads together, like I really am respecting this sort of interest in bringing pre-existing sort of older forms of cinema as well as innovative futuristic quote unquote forms together, hybridizing the digital and the analog, using things from like allusions to like 20s surrealism and then like very contemporary references as well. So yeah, I think maybe it makes sense to continue to sort of unspool your collective narrative, maybe in tandem with doing a little bit of close reading and unpacking of these two films, Poor Things and Fishbowl. So maybe we could start. I'm sorry.
It's all right. We got upstaged on the title by a very famous movie this past year.
Yeah. That's. I mean,
I look forward to us making a film called Poor Things, and then when we're asked about the title, we're like, I'm not familiar with another film named that.
We'll just omit the S, just Poor Thing.
Yeah. It's all Greek to me.
Seeing a full length Virosa film that has to do with like transplanting brains would be very cool.
You and me both, brother.
Both of these films, Fishbowl and Poor Magic, are very much located in space. And I'm interested in how the spirit of a place might imbue the work, the process of creating the work, and perhaps even the ensoulment of the work, just as a conjecture there. But so can you walk us through what Poor Magic is?
Yeah, I love this question or this lead up about the spirit of a place being integral to a work. Poor Magic was the first time that the three of us really, working together in this very multimedia, monstrous sort of way, decided to go through the whole process of writing and creating a short film that was very coherent, that was this singular story. And we wanted to synthesize a lot of these influences we've already been talking about, around horror, around surrealist silent cinema, and around, the psychological or alchemical dimensions of narrative. And we had the opportunity to film it at the place where, incidentally, we all met, which is an artist residency in northeastern Pennsylvania called Mildred's Lane, which is about 100 acres of deeply, deeply enchanted forest and meadow in the middle of nowhere. And it's a place where a lot of artists are gather historically to socialize and mentor one another and interact in different ways. And I think it's been an important place for all of us in our development, not least because the three of us, met there. I believe that the first time we were all there was on New Year's Eve, back in maybe 2014. Yeah. And it was some years before, we all became more and more entangled and
became neighbors.
Yes, yeah, back in Brooklyn. But yeah, it's a very charged place for us, and one that we also, I think had always been having ideas about how to utilize cinematically. It's a really cinematic place. It's very, very, there's a lot of energy there, a lot of non-human living energy in this landscape. So we were excited to have the run of the place in January 2020. Very building up to the era we now live in. It was right before the pandemic, very, very cold winter in Pennsylvania. And we brought our friend Eric Deal with us, the marvelous painter, actor, collaborator, and went about making this film in not exactly an ad hoc way, but I do remember storyboarding it the night before we shot. So it was very much created in response to the environment and to the conditions of just being there together.
We had talked about the film, I think, for a couple weeks prior, once we knew we were going to have access to the site, and we started to sketch out ideas verbally. But we showed up, I think, 3 or 4 days before Eric and sat down for those 3 days, basically, and conceived of as much of the film as we could. And by the time Eric showed up, we still weren't quite finished, but we were ready to go anyway. And so I think the site itself was important not only as a setting, but in terms of affecting the writing of the film itself, in terms of just being in that site entirely while writing it, basically.
Would you be able to just summarize the essential plot of what happens in this film?
Yeah, we have a foolish magician tries to encounter his shadow,
and mayhem ensues. Absolutely.
So a couple things I wanted to riff off of in that theme, in that key. I think that in the Western esoteric or American esoteric chaos magic or whatever Thelema traditions or subcultures, there's a lot of this desire to go out into the woods, into the enchanted woods, and do your ritual. There's this desire to go out and be isolated and to be able, because a lot of grimoires will require a long amount of time in isolation, and they will and if it's not part of the spell that you're looking up in a grimoire, then there's also just a general, even outside of esoteric circles, there's a general kind of desire to be alone in the woods that I think the American heart is stricken by in many instances, in many cases. And I think that the film definitely emphasizes being alone in the woods. There's one little shack in the middle of the woods, and these woods look very old. These trees look very old. You see the roots of one that's fallen over, and they're unctuous roots with lots of dirt and little tendrils, and you can tell it's an old tree that's been fallen there. And this attempt to go out and be isolated, to find yourself, is something that I very much dream of many times, and it's very hard to do. It's very hard to find those places in America that are isolated.
Yeah, it's impossible, really. Even on that property, which again, it's about 100 acres and it abuts a national forest. So there's miles and miles and miles of woods. You can still hear cars on the highway when you're in the middle of those woods at night. Which really, it puts you in touch with how, the human species has really invaded every corner of this planet with our presence, which is very loud and very disruptive. But if there are places that you can experience what you're talking about, which is an experience worth having, because when you're alone and deep in the woods, you will see the planet come alive in ways that aren't human. And this is why I love the place that we created, Poor Magic. I spent several nights there alone with no power once. And part of the reason it's hard to get away is because of our devices and the internet and even our electricity. It casts these kind of protective circles around us. And when you're separated from those things, it is uncanny how quickly other energies will reestablish themselves, and it can definitely be spooky and powerful.
Yeah, and there's also just this theme of circularity. I think comes up in this, like the snake chasing its own tail, because this person is ostensibly trying to find his shadow and capture his shadow, see his shadow, record his shadow, encounter himself, really. But I think that oftentimes in solitude, part of what is so ominous is one's own, it's oneself and it's also not oneself. That's kind of the definition of a shadow in this context. And the attempt to trap it, you can spook yourself out very, very, very much so. Yeah.
There's also a certain folly to it. It's like whether it's relying on a groundhog to shadow to, predict the end of winter, or it's trying to find some sort of self-gnosis. The idea of combining with the shadow self at all, or like of that being one thing, is it's a little silly in a way to even want to do that. Those things are already the same, but they can only exist because of each other.
Yeah. And I would also, just to add on that, I would say that there is, I think all three of us have a real fascination with other forms of knowledge and how certain knowledge is insulated and transmitted across time, usually in an esoteric or occulted tradition. I think we're also kind of cast a jaundiced eye to people who find that is something that can be known in its totality or leveraged for some kind of power or some kind of personal growth, shall we say. When I think that often what happens is that when it's a solitary practice or it's a practice that's located solely within the self, you tend to just kind of find yourself right where you began, if not a little bit worse. And I think that was kind of ghosting at the edges of the narrative that we were fascinated with. And then also this idea of just formally the capacity of time-based media to encourage a repeat viewing. Again, the location that we have is such a profound collection of non-human and non-living forces and of instances of life that maybe are not as readily apparent on the first viewing. So there's definitely a encouraging of a repeat viewing at play. That there might be more narratives happening than what you might just be seeing located within this poor magician.
Yeah, it definitely had that quality for me. It was one of those things, like a painting maybe, or like a song, where you like listen to it multiple times, and whatever you're bringing to it, you see different reflections and refractions depending on the context in which you're listening to it or watching it or like looking at it. Totally. Yeah. And this is calling to mind your interest in multimedia and like your various different influences.
Well, that's the beauty of cinema, right? the beauty of cinema allows for many levels of the story to happen, right? It's that either complement each other or argue with each other, or create a depth where you wouldn't normally find it if it was located solely within the solitary work of art or its constituent parts.
And one of the funny things, we were talking about the 20s surrealism, and before the episode we were preambling about this exquisite corpse sort of approach to things. But in light of those interesting moments where perhaps there's certain sort of like unconscious that you tap into, or that you transmit energy to somebody that they needed to see in a different way, contextualized based on their experiences that you had nothing to do with. Josh, I wonder if you would be interested in divulging what kind of resonance watching this brought up for you in relation to your dream world.
Yeah, I would like to say thank you for making that film, because it was crazy to see this sort of dream that I've had like actually happen somewhere else. And I'll just explain it very quickly. I used to have this recurring dream when I was younger that like the only parts of it that I can remember are just everything is pitch black and there's like a lamppost in the middle that's illuminated. And sometimes I'm at the lamppost, other times I'm in the dark looking at myself at the lamppost, and then like other times I'm just in the dark looking at the lamppost itself. And the only thing I can kind of remember is the feeling that I'm being chased or followed, and that there is some sort of safety within the darkness, but also that I'm pursuing the lamppost. But then if I get to the lamppost, the things in the dark can see me and I can't see them. Like there's some, like being in that illuminated space prevents me from sort of the protection of the dark and maybe puts me in some more danger. I don't remember much else about the dream because I stopped having it. Like somewhere in college, the dream stopped recurring. But seeing Poor Magic like kind of scared the shit out of me, because I was like, how the fuck did they know? You know what I mean? Like that sort of feeling. Or like I saw in the beginning, I was like, okay, I can kind of see where this is going. And then suddenly there was a shift and I thought, oh shit. Like, so brought me back to that space. I have to leave it there because it's still hard to digest kind of that parallel. And I very much internalized some of the dread the magician felt, because now I have to sort of revisit this thing that's like ominous and scary from my past. And it's like, I turned 30 in September, and now this has come up right as fall sort of like actually descends upon the city that I'm in currently, which is DC. And so, yeah, I don't know. It was unsettling to watch it.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that, first of all, Josh. Thank you.
Of course.
There's an additional yes and I have to that, which is a conversation the three of us have been having kind of in the ether right now, are these kind of instances of, the folklore of math tells us that time and space are the same, right? And I think there's been a fascination amongst us of like instances where that is like manifest, rather than just a subjective experience, or again, something that's an intellectual process told through the language of math. And I keep coming back to dreams as an example of time and space being bound to one another, and cinema being another example of that. And so I think there's been a real fascination amongst ourselves, specifically this last year, around dreams, what happens in the dream time, and cinema's capacity to share dreams with another, to allow someone else to inhabit one's imagination or one's dream. And that there's also a kind of a formal quality when it comes to cinema, where I'm sure we've all heard and experienced the fact that, the people around us see us better than we see ourselves, right? So in the instance of Poor Magic, we see the process that this poor magician is going through, with absolute clarity in a way that you can be sure this magician cannot. So I like to think that there's a sympathy we have for that character, and that there's a relationship baked in between our character, who we are tormenting in the dream time, with the people who live in, the shared space, the world.
Yeah, I think that everybody is caught up in some version of that dynamic. Your dream speaks to that too, and whether we're aware of it or not. And I do think that part of like the sort of esoteric practices that we've been bringing up are about getting into a closer dialogue with that kind of dynamic, those dynamics. But whether you are or not, you're part of one of those dynamics. And so I think there is a universal quality to the film, and it's also interesting in this way of like the dream space because of the unconscious aspect of dreams. And again, I think part of the process for us of making something in a very almost ad hoc way almost is this unconscious process of creation that we're fascinated by, because it's almost a bit like dreaming together, to put it in those terms.
Absolutely. Maybe one brief recollection more about Poor Magic. Just the fixation on, or just the fixation on lights and darkness. I was wondering if like in the beginning, one of the first sort of symbols we see is just a light bulb hanging there in the middle of the woods, connected to potentially an outlet somewhere, via a long cord. And then there's a lot of darkness in this film. But then another notable source of light is a candle that the protagonist stumbles over at one point in the dark, and then lights. And the light is like we've kind of described. There's a terrifying quality to being in the light, because then you're seen. There's also a terrifying quality to be in the dark, because then you can't see. I was just wondering if there's anything about these lights that have to do with an alchemical understanding of things, if there's anything there that you wanted to touch on before we continue to Fishbowl.
I think, speaking from a kind of different side, and then maybe one of the others can come from the alchemical side, we had been playing around with radioactive lens that we bought recently before making this. It's where the actual glass is made of thorium. And it also happens to have an extremely low f-stop value. So it shoots in low light really well. And so one of the things we set out to do is, can we make a film that has only one light source in every shot? And so that's part of what you were seeing when there's a little bit of moonlight, or one candle or one light bulb. We're like, can we get away with that? Can we have a picture that's dynamic, a set that feels dynamic with only literally one bulb or one candle?
Which is basically sacrilegious in, like contemporary filmmaking. The amount of lights that are being used in every shot, standard kind of filmmaking, are crazy. And so it was a structural conceit, and it was also a bit of a euphemism, like how to dress up the fact that we made the film for like $400.
And there's like no way to get electricity out there. Like we had to run like a 500-foot extension cord just to get that one.
How many extension cords do you have?
Actually, I ended up buying a car battery that was inside of that house prop that we were running the light bulb off of.
But it was 9 degrees that night, and the batteries kept draining.
Like in 20 minutes.
Yeah. Oh, man.
Yeah, the environment was against us, despite our proposition, and
Right.
it worked. I would also say that there's this, something I think we're also really fascinated in is this kind of complicating certain conversations around, say, like binaries or either or Aristotelian logic, if you will, and reframing that more as kind of polarities or spectrums or systems of correspondence. In alchemy, I think of the idiom that's used the most or most well known is as above, so below, which is essentially just a system of scalability correspondences at space primarily. But, when one kind of like expands that view to things like light, things like certain narrative dynamics, certain technical challenges, suddenly things start to get revealed in those kind of that proposition.
And for me specifically, and I think for you too, Brian, in the music and sound, that's one of my favorite as above, so below moments in the Virosa kind of sphere.
Yes.
Where we're really trying to use music and use sound, at least in my thinking of it, is like that a score should never show what's already known from the image. It should always be adding something that the image can't do. Some information that you can understand intuitively, but that an image could never possibly convey, or doesn't convey fully. And, in the example of Poor Magic, all of the music started with that waltz, really trying to convey that this guy is fucking around with some stuff he should not be, that he has no idea what he's doing, that there's a folly even to the general approach, and that's how the film opens.
And that it's a dance, ultimately, that it's a circular dance.
Yeah.
And it's a circle, the rhythm of the lumbering rhythm of the waltz itself also follows that form. So it's a little bit of a doctrine of signatures, I think, as we go to approach music and writing for the music for the films.
Yeah, and letting music and sound, like you're saying, Cameron, it's not just about this emphatic purpose, like, putting these underlines or accents on what you're telling visually, but actually telling the parts of the story that you can't create in image, and not even necessarily because we never work with significant budgets, it's also because some things can't really be represented that way, or it's actually more interesting to tell them in a more multi-sensory way.
I think that's a really good point. It's far more important to me for a film's music to say something conceptually rather than to offer a jump scare, highlight a beat, or try and create like an emotional connection through an image that you're supposed to have. That's why like drums are such a big, these like big like taiko drums are such a big thing in epic films. They want you to feel something at that moment, the hits, or
kind
like
of cheap.
Zimmer's drones, same thing.
Yeah,
it's like,
you can pay Hans Zimmer $100 million for a score, but you're going to get like these cheap drums that just do the same thing.
You might just get...
It might just be MSG,
yeah, just a good long womp sound and a few drum hits. Yeah.
I mean, that is something that I was thinking about, like, one of the many themes that I would love to spend another like 2 hours talking about is this like escape from Hollywood, this escape from the coasts that's come up a couple times in this podcast, but hasn't really been fleshed out yet. But I will say that like it is interesting. I feel like you are actually freed, liberated by the fact that you had like a $400 budget. If you want to be innovative when it comes to lighting, if you have a budget for the film, then you're kind of beholden to the budget to like have it be super saturated or whatever like is going to be sellable, because you have to have a return on the investment.
Well, and with great resources come great expectations from, the people that gave you the money about what something is supposed to look like.
Yeah, and it's also like, maybe that has to do also with the idea that each part of the creation helps ensoul the project in some way. And if that's the case, then the funding would be part of that, which means that the lifeblood would be coming from a specific type of entity. But
it's an occluded part of the process, the resources available, and one's access to the resources. And there's also kind of a constant law of cinema where it seems also no matter how much money or resources you have, it's never enough, So you might as well paint yourself into a corner, so to speak, with your resources. We haven't had the luxury of that choice, but I think it's been an incredible. It'll expose things, and it'll test your abilities as filmmakers, as artists, as people who can work as a team, and there's also a heightened awareness of what people individually can bring within that kind of set of propositions, and often where things get really exciting is when in this kind of, we've been calling it ad hoc and improvised, but I think that's an essential part of any process of cinema, because it allows for the unexpected to happen. It allows for problem solving to happen in a fruitful kind of a way, or things get revealed in the problems that maybe we're not able to preconceive of or anticipate.
Okay, I think another theme to pull out here that'll connect directly to Fishbowl is this search for a specific kind of knowledge. I feel like there's I feel like we're still in the shadow of the Enlightenment in this era, where people have a desire for, just like they have a desire for solitude, quote unquote, in the woods to like find themselves. There's also this desire for like what something is, a definition. You need, categorization, endless categorizations. And, how do you get the spell to work? But also, how do we categorize this life form? How do we categorize this experience? How do we pathologize this and that? And so, just that is a sort of like a hanging theme there. Would one of you be interested, or would you be willing to now describe what Fishbowl is, both as a, what it meant to create it, and also what is it as a film?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In response to these ideas you've just put forward, I will say I think we all would probably condone this statement that Virosa represents the endarkenment. All of those ideas, this kind of post-enlightenment legacy, these are ideas that we're very interested in creating work that can move past that and even operate oppositionally to that. And so, the sort of ontologies of the work, what kind of knowledge of reality is the work contributing to, like, these are things that we definitely talk about. And I think when it comes to Fishbowl, we've always in our dialogues together been interested in the, how stories themselves are vehicles for knowledge across time and across space, as well as the kinds of stories that are particularly persistent across time. And so out of these, these interests in knowledge across deep scales of time comes Fishbowl, which is in short, and there's never too much that needs to be said plot-wise about our work, because they're not really plot oriented, but it's about a man who begins breaking into the La Brea Tar Pits Museum in Los Angeles to clean fossilized specimens from the tar. And we follow him doing this, his sort of confessional about this process from an unknown or more mysterious point of view. You experience the film from the point of view of someone who is seeming to study him and to observe this archive of his activities, and you're left to kind of speculate what that point of view is that you're meant to occupy. And the only other thing I'll say about this, just like in terms of it as a piece of media, is however you want to frame it, whether it's post-internet or post-pandemic, this film is really kind of our statement about like post-internet cinema, because it was created after Brian moved to Los Angeles during the pandemic. We had been sharing a physical studio as Virosa for several years. And when Brian moved to LA, our work necessarily changed. You know, the dynamic of our collaboration had to kind of shift, and I don't recall even discussing it all that much, you know, like that it was going to be an issue for Virosa, that Brian was going to go to the West Coast, because I think we knew that interesting things would come of that. And I'll pass it over to Brian to pick up the next part of the story of Fishbowl.
Because one question to interject there is like, was a portion of this was shot like on the at the La Brea tar pits? Is that correct?
Yes.
The majority of the film was shot on iPhones, actually, in one day, actually a few hours, access to the La Brea Tar Pits Museum. And the crew of one, me, on that site. And then, of course, when we got to share space, we were able to expand the narrative and contribute again in this kind of collective way that we always do. As far as the genesis of this story, it came very much in response to the La Brea Tar Pits as a site, as a place, and the existence of the tar itself, which really exemplifies in fascinating ways things that I think the three of us have been fascinated for a while, which are, what is the boundary between, say, a living thing and a non-living thing? To what extent is the deep past informed by the deep future in the present moment? And there was this unique opportunity to film within the museum at the La Brea Tar Pits. The laboratory that's in there, the title of the film comes from the laboratory itself, which is referred to as the Fishbowl, which is the first of its kind. It's now kind of fairly common bit of architecture to find or feature within natural history museums, specifically natural history museums that are engaged in research. And the museum is very much in a process of transformation itself. So it's this idea of everything being in a kind of state of change and this kind of liminal space. And it organically, the narrative came forth of how would someone engage in those kind of spaces with that deep past and those deep futures in largely a process of unknowing, and guided by a compulsion, an intuition, a seeming deficiency in themselves that they wouldn't even be able to identify, but nonetheless were compelled to enact and transgress, and the mysteries that would kind of spread from that.
Right, which is told through the main character, who expresses that, you know, he doesn't really know why he does this thing that seems really irrational, you know, that he's breaking into a museum and working with these specimens, and yet he doesn't really know why. He doesn't have, he can't explain particularly what he's doing.
And I enjoy that because it brings in this sense of degeneracy and this sense of like, yeah, he's doing like fugitive paleontology. He's doing like it's like a delinquency. It's like a pathology of, you know, his own pathology that it's funny that that's something that is a very respected, you know, thing, is to like go dig up bones and dust them off and inspect them for like your entire life. And then this person,
most people need a PhD to do that.
Right. But the idea of breaking into it as a again, as like a delinquent, as like a, you know, in a criminal way, is funny.
It's also an incredibly mundane thing to criminalize yourself for.
Yes.
Exactly. And I will say, I think that the digital, the sort of the layering and the distortions of the visuals, the framings, the multiplying of the frames, the many different artistic exposures and stuff that we see, does a lot of the work of world building in a kind of non-linear way almost. Like it kind of builds out enough sort of opalescence around the action on the screen that one is kind of invited to create their own speculative world around it. I don't know if that's something you.
I'm curious
wanted to
how
touch
you
on.
would characterize that world building. I mean, just legitimately, you know,
Yeah.
I think the intention of that compositing was to create this mysterious sort of frame story. So I'm always just curious for how people
Yeah.
interpret that.
Well, for me, like, at first it's like, is this a? I mean, for me, it kind of reminds me of a kind of a future entity civilization that's kind of able to access information quite well and almost invasively, and is going through all these different records, almost like an akashic, has access to like almost an akashic record, is able to do paleontology of the moment, of all moments, and is digging through these different archives of what was, and is finding this interesting file, this interesting little pattern that happened where this guy was breaking into this place and doing his own form of paleontology. So I see it as like some sort of the paleontological. That's kind of a fun thing. Urge, expressed in multiple different time forms. Because if it's so as above, so below, then that means the entity who's doing the searching is wondering themselves why this other person is so interested in doing this digging through bones, and that person is interested in why is like fascinated in this
It's
search.
totally recursive, right? Yeah, it's like,
Yeah. Go ahead.
why is this person interested in this random little thing that happened presumably in the deep past, but, it's the same reason that the original guy was interested in this random thing that happened in the deep past. Like, some things just have this salience across time.
And I think it hints at and talks about how accessing an archive or information changes that archive or that information or that data itself, where, it's almost like a Schrodinger's archive, I guess. Like the very fact of viewing the archive is changing the archive.
I'm sure there are people that would prefer to not see the remains removed from the tar pits, to not have them subjected to scientific study. There's a point at which the sort of narrator in Fishbowl even asks Austin, would you want your remains to be kind of dug up and examined? And he says no.
That's something I wrote down. He says no. He says, I don't think no, because I'm not special enough.
Right. Again, his reasoning is actually surprising, and that's where maybe the deeper layer of our thematic interest lies in the film.
That is another theme. That's another theme that I definitely was interested in. This he at the beginning he doesn't even name himself. The querent asks like what his name is, and he says asks can you say your name, and he says no, because I think that there's at first there's the sense that he's aware that he was being delinquent. It's almost like he's on trial for that, so he gives like a false name. He just calls himself Austin, so I don't even know his name. And there's also he makes allusions to the fact that he was able to sleep on the job at his office all the time and no one noticed. So he goes through these motions unnoticed by people in life. And then also, he's also like every other day, apparently, he goes to this place to compulsively do the study of these bones, which itself is also unnoticed. So there's sort of this invisibility through being so normal or so, unremarkable. And yet, there is also this, but then to be gazed upon and studied, that's its own kind of existential horror, like to be beheld, right?
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said too that there's a recursiveness with the material of tar as well throughout the narrative that speaks to a lot of the themes that we've been talking about within the narrative, which is the paleontological proposition of can you actually extract a specimen out of the tar, even though the tar itself is a hyper object of sorts of other other forms of death, of decay. So to remove or clean, prepare the specimen, is to decide that other forms of specimens are unknowable or are waste or need to be reintegrated back into the ground. What's fascinating with me when you were actually at the site of the La Brea tar pits is it is in a completely ungovernable space. The tar comes up all around the surrounding neighborhood in different spaces. It bubbles up in the asphalt, in the grass. It is in constant motion. You can smell it all the time. Its presence is always felt, even if you can't see it. And, spending any measure of time there, you will inevitably find it on your clothes, the bottom of your shoes. It lingers in your sinuses, and you kind of taste it after you're being there, and that includes even being in this kind of curated or contained vessel of the museum itself.
It's actually a similar energy to the kind of thing you're talking about experiencing deep in the forest, but one which is inserting itself into an urban environment, and so becomes uncanny in its own kind of way.
Absolutely. In the film, there's some dialogue, there's a bit about the tar being maybe alive, the tar having its own, composite sort of awareness. And to me, on kind of a, bit of a animist tip that's been infusing this podcast project, that makes a lot of sense. It also speaks to this idea of the spirits of place, which I'm also very much interested in, animating what happens in that place. For example, this tar pit, perhaps it has all sorts of chthonic entities that are interested in preserving life. I mean, preserving specimens. Because if you think about what tar does, it does kill the subject that gets stuck in it, but it also preserves the specimen of that thing. So it's this moment of preservation through death, a sort of undeath that the tar performs on the different
I'll do you one
subjects.
better. I would say it remembers. It contains the memory of what it, and that and then when we're talking about spirit, I don't want to speak out of turn here, but to me, to the extent that a spirit exists in the binding force, all the things that we've been talking about, is the story of it, of these things, of these boundaries, of these different instances. That tends to be where it exists, in this kind of ephemeral space, and via language, which is itself, an invocation of sorts.
Mm-hmm. I had kind of a thesis to throw out there. So if you'll indulge me, there was this idea that alchemy, even as a practice, has origins kind of in the Dark Ages, quote unquote. This moment of a time where we have a lack of archival data for a variety of reasons. We have to dig through records to find this esoteric knowledge. And I kind of had this thought that as we go forward in time into this kind of moment, we there's this idea that we're facing a kind of ironically another dark age right now of information, because of the proliferation of information, as well as the utilization of large language models and web crawlers and stuff that essentially take all of the different information and then degrade it through repetition. For example, if you Google something, you'll get an AI response that is generated from the AI trawling the internet for different data about it. But then there's also AI produced articles that the AIs are then taking from. So this process will mutate the information beyond recognition. So there's kind of an interesting way in which this proliferation of information is becoming unstable and is degrading our ability to have a record, to have a history, right? So it's my kind of thing is that perhaps the like the internet and the deluge of information is its own tar of our age, and this kind of impossible project of trying to hold on to something and preserve it, being something that changes and kills it in the process. Trying to information degrading history, and the attempt to try to maintain specific meaning, just continually falling short.
And for me, you're describing essentially AI kind of self-modulating, right? And eventually creating a feedback, this feedback loop. And that's kind of exactly what happens in sound too, right? When you put a guitar up to an amplifier, it starts self-modulating itself and increases that frequency of tone until it just becomes blaring noise. Which in the case of this film, just to kind of get my little music spiel out, that's exactly how all of the music was composed, only using FM synthesis, basically, which stands for frequency modulation. Basically, it's one sound being edited or changed by forcing another sound into it. And so it's doing exactly what you're saying and exactly what is happening to our characters in the film. And, the characters being this kind of the fingers, the interviewee, and the tar, and the museum themselves. It's happening to all of them. They're being modulated by being accessed.
Mm-hmm. By being accessed through these various bodies as well. There's this sort of hard drive, this sort of speculative hard drive that the film suggests maybe the story of Austin is embodied within. And of course, he's dealing with the embodied archive of both the museum and the tar itself. It's interesting how, even revisiting Fishbowl very recently before this, I feel like there's been such a shift, such a development around AI since we released this film, like less than 3 years ago, where just, my sci-fi mind thinks about the sort of believability of what's going on with this future archivist dealing with what could be, a sort of corrupted AI facsimile of someone who is long dead. Like this sort of thing is just, even since we made the film, is becoming more and more kind of present in our consciousness. I think that, like, yeah, maybe you could interact in this way with any moment in time or any like past living entity because of the infinite way that information is being cataloged and stored. But we also know that that's a really imperfect process, and that much like a dead organism degrading inside the tar, those speculative future digital archives will also be, kind of monstrous and haunted and different from whatever they were.
And we had discussed that idea of the possibility of there being some kind of digital necromancy happening there. But I think what you're saying is that feels even more real maybe now than we were talking about.
Yeah, that was before that, the like voice AIs of like Frank Sinatra and like dead people started to come out. Some really haunted shit has happened since then.
Yeah. And as also another factor I think we had talked about in the developing of the narrative, and then as we were putting it together, and now as it exists, that these kind of fantasies of deep futures, the promise of AI, singularities, consciousness uploading, there's a bit of a fantasy that you can somehow escape your own humanity, or that there's kind of a solution will present itself, a liberation can be found within there. And I think we've always kind of proposed that, like, no matter, again, as above, so below, this kind of recursiveness, this scalability, that no matter where you go, the human remains. solely
Or
because
at
it is
least
a product
the
of
body
human.
remains.
The
The
body
body
remains,
remains.
yes.
That there
And
is
the
this embodiment that can't be escaped. That
Yeah.
That the body is integral to the experience.
Yeah.
That there is no transcendent form of consciousness because it's all, it is necessarily bound up in its embodied form. So this is part of the way that we talk a little skeptically about transhuman futurist ideas, but also one that is interesting to explore through cinema, which is a deeply embodied medium.
What do you think of the phrase all energy, all power that's ever and will ever exist is like right here, right now?
I tend to ascribe to that. I think it's a way, as I was saying before, I think what this film satisfies is illustrating something that I think is very deeply felt and shared amongst the three of us, which is, again, that the present moment is defined as much by the deep past as the deep future. Again, the folklore of math says that our kind of linear experience of time and space is weird, or that at the very least, that's a kind of perversion, actually, of the laws of the universe as we understand them. Yet that's not something we have as an embodied experience directly. We have very kind of, if anything, that kind of non-linearity, non-temporality resists language. It resists the ways that we communicate to each other. So in a lot of ways, there seems to be this kind of promise, a kind of renewed urgency around maybe unknowing certain things, around kind of accepting that the need to categorize, the need to have an answer for the thing is going to forever be elusive, but that the structures, the processes, the artifacts that we create around that, to the extent that there is an answer, it can be reflective, that can reflect something about our nature as a collective species that the individual just fundamentally can't. And even at the limits of our sharing with one another can't. And this, again, has a kind of renewed urgency and importance for things like culture, stories, things that a person can't say that they're the singular author of.
Yeah, we're very interested, I think, in the kinds of knowledge that come from these states of unknowing, and I mean, I think this idea you reference, basically the implications of general relativity on our understanding of reality as a species and a culture are going to take a very long time to play out, and on some level are things that will always resist language and rationalization. And being able to capture just a little bit of those kinds of knowledge, that's what stories are for. That's certainly what our stories are for, and I think that's why Fishbowl ends on the note that it does, with, again, a sort of paradox of the subject Austin talking about the multiple stages of death that something goes through, and that that when something truly dies is when, as he says, when someone says your name for the last time, like this suggesting that when something is forgotten. But within a world where space and time are always present, when everything that ever was and is will be forever, that never really happens, which is affirmed by the intervention of this archivist who is listening to him, who is hearing his name, who is seeing him. Like there's this mutation and this warping across time of whatever his reality is, but it's still there somewhere.
So the kind of the thing is, the problem that I'm trying to figure out is, you know, I feel the need for having some kind of script to run on as I navigate things, and yet at the same time, any static script can, usually has unsavory byproducts. So, like, how do you square those two truths? How do you square the fact that your things are always changing and your circumstances are always changing, and we live in a dynamic system, with the need to set things down into words?
Well, I'm wondering if, as an approach, we can use our archivist and our tar characters maybe as a lens through which to look at it, even maybe pulling back from some archived versions and reanimating them into the form that it is now.
Yeah, I would say the ending phrase of this is particularly, I think, resonates for me. How's that feel to rot with glee, to decay with me? And I would say my reflexive response to your question before even reading this would be that it's not up to you. It's not up to any of us, really. It's kind of a process that we are influenced by and can in turn influence, but there isn't really a final state to anything, right? And to the extent that there is a final form or a superstructure to the whole thing, we'll never know. And to the extent that we will know it, it's this kind of understanding that we are subject to certain inescapable processes, like death, like the transmutation of the body, call it a reunion, if you will, with the earth, which will then in turn be reunited with the universe itself. So there is kind of like, at the kind of ghosting at the edges of those kind of processes of transition, there is a kind of, I wouldn't call it stasis, but a form starts to emerge, right? This idea of time and space being one and the same. So I would say that we have this really curious quality of being able to do things and say things and have, agency, so to speak, in the moment. But, who knows if that's real or not? And I think that's the kind of governing question.
Yeah, they keep living even when you think they're done.
Yes.
They're not. You just kind of relinquish control over them at a certain point if you put them out into the world. It's the same with films, and that is part of why I like making texts in films. But yeah, the last line of your manifesto really resonates with the kind of degenerate cinema philosophy, I think, to the point that I would maybe offer a fragment of a bit of a manifesto we created recently, which seems to maybe put a bit of a pin in some of the things that we've just been discussing.
The Mutant Manifesto, I like it being just kind of an endless manifesto, too.
Yeah.
Think about all it takes for a mutation is the addition or removal of one thing.
Exactly. Absolutely.
And so it could just be an endless chain of lipids or whatever, then you decide what a protein is later.
Yeah.
Right. Evolution never ends.
Evolution never ends. And, like, to me, like, mutating is life, like, in the sense, okay, there's, like, so many different ways that you can bifurcate what life is. But for me, like, vibrant life is mutation. Undeath is stasis. Like, so it's like both, you can see life and death in mutation. You can see life and death in stasis. But I guess my roulette chips are on the mutation side,
Yeah, which makes life inherently monstrous. But,
Exactly.
This is why we're interested in cultivating an aesthetics that can appreciate that monstrosity and that sense of flux and constant change.
Yeah. I think, I'm really glad to, one of the things I'm glad to be partaking in, in this time around or whatever, is finding unexpected kinship in this monstrosity. And, you know, I think that, yeah, I definitely see that with your project, and I'm really glad to have to made this connection.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's great to talk about it with you.
Thank you so much for being on. Is there anything that y'all would like to direct the listeners to? I mean, we'll link the 2 videos in your website. What else?
Yeah, we're in the midst of trying to put together some resources for a somewhat bigger production, so it's all very under wraps, but we hope to have much more to plug in the future.
Yeah, we always have a lot to share.
Well, maybe when the next
so
thing...
we're looking forward to sharing it.
Yeah, when the next thing that you're able to plug emerges, you can do so on this platform once again.
Love to.
I think we'll have a lot to talk about, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes it feels like something went wrong, and that's why we're here. That we're in some kind of cosmic cage or simulated psyop. We become in the face of simulations and psyops, and from wrongness spring, syncretism is for the honorable and dishonorable alike. In thought and in body, no one, not two, in sky and seed sown, we dream up shadows to love through and hold their calloused hands, shaping change in the nether pool from breath to breath, and coming up again and again, seeking vistas of freedom.
Learn from the labyrinths and breathing mountains. How do you look, and where are you looking? Note when you're stuck, put sugar on your tradition pills, and record before breaking. How's that feel to rot with glee, to decay with me?
Like the process of radioactive decay in unstable atoms, degeneration yields a more sustainable nature.